So this is chapter 5, ecosystems and living organisms. And what we will cover here is evolution, the principles of population ecology, biological community, species richness in a community, and community development. These are all very ecology heavy terms. So whatever you don't understand, please make sure to email me. All the living species today descended from earlier species through the process known as evolution. This concept dates back to the time of Aristotle. However, it wasn't until Charles Darwin in the 19th century proposed natural selection, which is the mechanism of evolution that the scientific community accepts today. And what is natural selection? Well, it's basically that the individuals with more favorable genetic traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. And the frequency of favorable traits increase in subsequent generations. That is adaptation. Darwin proposed this in his monumental book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, published in 1859. Natural selection has 4 observations about the natural world that are very important and that you all need to know. Number 1, it requires high reproductive capacity. So each species produces more offspring than will survive to maturity. Number 2, there is heritable variation. The individuals in a population exhibit variation. Some traits improve the chances of an individual's survival and reproductive success, and the variation necessary for evolution by natural selection must be inherited so that it can be passed to offspring. Number 3, the limits on population growth or a struggle for existence. Only so much food, water, light, growing space, and so on are available to a population, and organisms compete with one another for the limited resources available to them. Other limits on population growth include predators and diseases. And number 4, differential reproductive success. Reproduction is the key to natural selection. The best adaptive individuals reproduce the most successfully, whereas less fit individuals die prematurely or produce fewer or less viable offspring. In some cases, enough changes may accumulate over time in geographically separated populations, often with slightly different environments, to produce new species. And this diagram that I have right here really helps you guys to understand the theory of evolution by natural selection. So keep this in mind for your exam. And now we move on to the principles of population ecology. Individuals in a given species that live in the same area at the same time are part of a larger organization known as a population. And population exhibit characteristics distinct from those of the individuals within them. Some of the features characteristic of populations but not of individuals are population density, birth and death rates, growth rates, and age structure. So population ecology is the study it's a branch within biology that deals with the numbers of a particular species found in an area and how and why those numbers change. Population ecologists try to determine the population processes common to all populations. They study how a population responds to its environment, such as how individuals in a population may compete for food or other resources, how predation, disease, and other environmental pressures affect the population, and a population, whether of bacteria or maples or giraffes, cannot increase indefinitely because of such environmental pressures. Additional aspects of populations that are important to environmental science are their reproductive success or failure, and how populations affect the normal functioning of communities and development. That's why we're talking about community development. The understanding population ecology is important for endangered species, invasive species, and even proper management of the everyday common species. So what is population density? Well, it is the number of individuals of a species per unit of area or volume at a given time. That seems a little bit complicated, but if we look below, these two ovals are two representations of population. Which one do you think is more dense, even if the number of individuals is the same? I think you would say the one on the left, right? Because of the fact that the given area is so small that it is obviously higher density than that of the one on the right. So that is population density. And we try to understand globally how population density changes in terms of the growth rate. And that is the rate of change of a population size expressed as a percent per year. Here is a very easy equation for you guys to remember related to growth rate. R, growth rate, equals the number of births minus the number of deaths. So what's the change in population size globally? Well, births is an input, increases population. Death is an output, it decreases population. But as we have seen, growth rate also includes dispersal, and dispersal is the movement of individuals in or out of an area. Dispersal is important for population management, the dispersal of genes. So now let's incorporate that into our global diagram. So inputs are now births and immigration to a local population, and outputs are deaths and emigration to a local population. Here's the equation again to include immigration and emigration. So birth and death are together, and immigration and emigration are together, right? Something that scientists use to understand population growth under ideal conditions is the maximum population growth and the intrinsic rate of growth, so the biotic potential. Different species have different intrinsic rates of increase, and several factors influence a particular species' intrinsic rate of increase. Remember, this is the rate of growth under ideal conditions. It makes an exponential curve, a J-shaped curve, just like the one you see right here on the right side. And what are some of those life history characteristics that influence it? Well, it's the age of onset reproduction, the fraction of lifespan for reproduction, the number of reproductive periods, the number of offspring per reproductive period. So think of humans, right? How our population grows is based on these life history characteristics. We aren't born and immediately can reproduce. We have a limited number of reproductive periods, right? Or we start reproduction at a certain time period. So those are important factors that influence our biotic potential, our intrinsic rate of growth. Exponential population growth is accelerating population growth when optimal conditions are constant reproductive rate over time. But that is not always possible because outside influences, environmental influences, cap the amount of individuals in a population. Why? Because an environment can only support a maximum number of individuals. That is called the carrying capacity of the environment, and it is usually denoted within science as a K. So as you see here in that right graph, we have the J curve has now hit the carrying capacity and leveled off. So the J curve is now turning into an S-shaped curve of logistic population growth. A great example is right here, and it's provided in your book, is of the rockfish populations that had skyrocketed and were overfished But over time, thanks to strict fishing regulations and a reduction in destructive fishing practices such as trawling, by the way, is basically dragging a giant heavy net across the bottom of the ocean floor. It can kill off a lot of species as well as kill off a lot of the environment. So the fishing regulations have reduced the overfishing of them, allowing for the carrying capacity of the environment to bounce back and increase population growth. So human intervention can even decrease the carrying capacity of an environment. That's why sustainable harvest is important. Another thing that we have seen is that too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So similar to overshooting our ecological footprint, there is overshooting the carrying capacity, which can lead to a population crash. A good example is a baby reindeer here shown off the coast of Alaska. These reindeer were basically introduced in the 1910s. And their population increased exponentially for about 25 years until there were approximately 2,000 reindeer. So it went from 26 reindeer to 2,000. And that was way more than the island could support, particularly in the winter, because obviously the ground freezes over, there's not that much vegetation, and the population just basically crashed, as you see right here. There was the introduction in the number of reindeer in the 1910s, and increased significantly, shot up very, very high, hit 2,000. The island could no longer, hit the carrying capacity. It had overgone the carrying capacity. Because of that, it sharply declined into the 1950s to basically no reindeer on the island. There are natural mechanisms that influence population size that fall into two categories: density dependent and density independent. And these are known as limiting factors. They are antibiotic or abiotic factors that cause a decrease in population growth. You need to know this, okay? This is important for your exam. Density dependent factors are influenced by the population size, and some examples are predation, disease, and competition. So these are interactions within the population that can decrease the overall population size. Density independence are factors that affect population size but are not influenced by changes in the population density. So outside pressures, think about the environment, so a killing frost, severe blizzard, and fire. Please know this. This is very, very important for your exam. And besides that, we look at survivorship for populations and species. It's very important for ecologists to construct life tables for plants and animals that show the likelihood of survival for individuals at different times in their lives. This was originally developed by insurance companies to determine how much policy should cost depending on the characteristics of the person, and now we do it for species. Survivorship is the proportion of individuals surviving at each age in a given population. This figure, which is figure 5.9, is a graph that shows the three main survivorship curves recognized by ecologists. In type 1, as exemplified by humans and elephants, the young, that is those individuals that cannot reproduce yet, and those at the reproductive age have a high probability of living. The probability of survival decreases more rapidly with increasing age, and deaths are concentrated at later in life. In type 3 survivorship, the probability of death is greatest early in life, and those individuals that avoid early death have a high probability of survival. So fish are usually type 3 survivorship. Yeah. Type 2 survivorship are intermediate between types 1 and types 2. The probability of survivorship does not change with age. The probability of death is likely across all age groups, resulting in a linear decline in survivorship. Lizards usually have a type 2 survivorship, and technically type 2 is very, very rare to be seen. Instead of being distributed as one large population across the landscape, many species occur as local populations in distinct habitat patches. Each local population has its own characteristic birth, death, immigration, and emigration rates. This is called metapopulations. And these metapopulations can be considered coming from a source habitat or a sink habitat. Source habitats are habitats that are more suitable, they have greater births than deaths, and they have high emigration dispersal, so more people are leaving. Sink habitats are less suitable habitats, they have more deaths than births, and immigration is needed to maintain the population, right? And we need more people to come in. I'm going to give you a personal example. In 2019, I had to study hippos in the Colombian River Magdalena Basin. Okay, why were there hippos there? Well, in the 90s, Pablo Escobar, famous narco-trafficker, had a farm in which he had kind of like a zoo safari farm in which he brought in 4 hippos, 3 females and 1 male. So it was basically hippo reproductive heaven for that 1 male. He reproduced and without any problem, and had a sizable population. This in one lake, in one big lake that Pablo Escobar created for them. When he was killed in the early 90s, the hippos were not able to be moved because the Colombian government could not afford to move them. Those 4 hippos stayed there, reproduced, had a great time, and now there is a population of around 50 to 60 hippos. Now, why am I not telling you the exact number of hippos there are? Well, this is where metapopulations come in. That source habitat population, right, was very strong, but there was 1 alpha male. What happened is the other sub males wanted to reproduce. Obviously, that is not allowed, right? In hippo dynamics. So those sub males would leave and go to a sink habitat, right? And reproduce with whatever females they brought with them. However, interbreeding would occur, and thus it would not have a sizable, healthy population. Thus, immigration was needed to maintain those subpopulations. Because they were moving on their own, we were not able to track every single subpopulation. That is why there is an estimate of how many hippos there are in the Magdalena River Basin. I hope that kind of helps explain what metapopulations are. But if it doesn't, just let me know and I can give you another example. Another important ecological concept is that of ecological niche. Now, any particular species in a community has a role. That is considered its niche, right? It helps to create the role and function of an ecosystem when each species has a niche. There are different types of niches. So the potential idealized ecological niche of any organism is the fundamental niche, but various factors such as competition with other species usually exclude it from part of its fundamental niche. Thus, the lifestyle an organism actually pursues and the resources it actually uses to make up is its realized niche. Okay, an example that may clarify the distinction between fundamental and realized niches is that of the green and brown anole of South Florida, which you see right here. The green anole is native to Florida and other southern states. They perch on trees, shrubs, walls, fences. You probably have seen them during the day and wait for insects and spider prey. In the past, these lizards were found all throughout Florida. Then a number of years ago, around in like the 1970s, a related species, the brown anole, was introduced from Cuba into southern Florida, and it became quickly common. Suddenly, green anoles became rare, apparently driven out of their habitat by competition from the slightly larger brown lizards. Careful investigation disclosed that green anoles were still around, yet they were, however, now largely confined to the vegetation and wetlands and to the foliated crowns of trees where they were less obvious. The habitat portion of the green anole's fundamental niche includes the trees and trunks and crowns of trees, exterior house walls, and many other locations. But since becoming established, the brown anoles drove out the green anoles from all but the wetlands, and so the green anoles' realized niche has now become smaller as a result of the competition. Okay, so that is a great example of fundamental versus realized niche. And here is an explanation of it. You guys can look in your book for the full story about it. And you can see it every day outside your house if you live in South Florida. Limiting resources. Similar to limiting factors, limiting resources are an environmental resource that, because it's scarce or at an unfavorable level, restricts the ecological niche of an organism. So as a limiting factor reduces the population size, a limiting resource restricts the ecological niche or the role of an organism to be fully fulfilled. And that can be nutrients, food, territory, or water. And organisms compete when resources are not plentiful, right? If there is too little of a limiting factor, there are no individuals or few individuals. If there's just the right amount, there's abundant individuals. But if there's too much of a limiting factor, then there will be more competition and more individuals, which will then drive down the population of a certain species or of a certain group, thus becoming few individuals or no individuals. So as you can see here, there is that sweet spot right in the middle for limiting factors. And now that we've brought up competition, well, there are different relationships within populations that determine how a population behaves. So competition is probably the most well-known one. It's an interaction among organisms that live for the same resource in an ecosystem. I don't know why it says vie for the same ecosystem. And there are two types of competition within species: intraspecific and interspecific. Intraspecific means competitions between individuals in a population. Interspecific is competition between individuals of two different species. So the top one is interspecific because we have a lion and a hyena competing for probably some food, a dead animal. So that's interspecific. Intraspecific is between individuals of the same population or like the same species. And as you see here, we have these, I'm not sure what they are, but it's some type of ungulate fighting for a resource. Symbiosis is basically an intimate relationship between members of two or more species, and participants may be benefited, harmed, or unaffected by the relationship. It's the result of co-evolution, actually. The best example is flowering plants and their animal pollinators. They have a symbiotic relationship because the pollinators have some sort of adaptation that allows them to feed on the plant, which then allows the plant to develop an adaptation so that their seed gets on the animal, whether through ingestion or on the fur or feathers, and then can be transported elsewhere to increase the number of individuals elsewhere of the plant. There are three main types of some symbiosis. There's mutualism, so both species are benefiting. Commensalism, one species is benefiting, the other one is getting nothing. Parasitism. So one species is benefiting, the other one is actually getting harmed. Predation, that's the other one that you guys may have heard, that is very common, is the consumption of one species prey by another, the predator. And there are many examples of predator-prey interactions. The most common is pursuit and ambush, which is hunting, and that's why I have this orcas hunting in a pack in Alaska. This cooperative behavior increases hunting success, and plants and animals have established specific defenses against predation through evolution, such as creating thorns or chemicals that they release once or an animal chews on a leaf. It releases these like toxic chemicals to make the animal uncomfortable so that it stops feeding on it. Keystone species, and that is a species often a predator that exerts profound influence on a community. It's more important to the community than what would be expected based on abundance. The dependence of other species on the keystone species is apparent when the keystone species is removed, and protecting keystone species is a goal to conservation biologists. A really good example, which your book covers and is probably the one that is taught the most in all ecology courses, is that of the Yellowstone wolf. The Yellowstone wolf was extirpated from the Yellowstone area in the 1800s, yet with the Endangered Species Act in 1874, they were listed, and now, starting in the 90s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service captured some of the great wolves in Canada and released them into Wyoming. What this has shown is other aspects of the Yellowstone ecosystem and food web have rebounded and increased. So previously, when the wolves were extirpated, which if you remember means locally extinct, there was a lot of moose and ungulates being like pasture grazing animals such as deer, were eating a lot of vegetation, right? Moose and deer, so much that they were reproducing at a ridiculous rate, and the below ground biomass and net primary productivity reduced significantly. Once the wolf was introduced, it kind of balanced out the population of the moose and the deer, and thus we saw a greater increase in primary productivity of vegetation in Yellowstone. So more plant species rebounded and were more plentiful. So you can see that a keystone species really affects the other trophic levels within a food web. And even what makes them keystone is that it influences it indirectly. Species richness. So now we're going to be moving into species richness in a community. It varies greatly from one community to the other. Tropical rainforests and coral reefs are examples of communities with high species richness. Geographically isolated islands and mountaintops usually exhibit low species richness. But what determines the number of species in a community? Well, several factors appear to be significant. The abundance of potential ecological niches, closeness to the margins of adjacent communities, geographic isolation, the dominance of one species over others, habitat stress, and geologic history. Species richness is related to the abundance of potential ecological niches. Ecosystem services. Conservationists maintain that ecosystems with greater species richness, but better supply such ecosystem services than ecosystems with lower species richness. Traditionally, most ecologists assume that community stability, aka the absence of change, is a consequence of community complexity. Stability is the result of resistance and resilience. Resistance is the ability of a community to withstand environmental disturbances, natural or human events that disrupt the community. Resiliency is the ability of a community to recover quickly to its former state following an environmental disturbance. A community with considerable species richness may function better, that is, have more resistance and resiliency, than a community with less species richness. One reason why that's why some people may want to diversify the crops, the number of crops they grow, because it provides different nutrients for the soil, particularly when cycling nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, which are the limiting nutrients for plants. Here are some examples of ecosystem services. Here are some other ones. So as I mentioned, community stability is the absence of change, and it's a result of resistance and resiliency. So as I mentioned, species richness can make communities more stable. And gardens as ecosystems. I always include this section, even though it's not very important, but it's a case of how urban and suburban gardens can be seen as ecosystems that provide resiliency and resistance to disturbance because they increase the diversity and species richness within an area. Lawns, right, that are just made of one type of grass are not that resistant or resilient to natural events, right? To disaster events, sorry. But if you see here, this garden with all of its different species will have deeper roots and provide more ecosystem services than that of a lawn. Community development, and then we're going to talk about primary succession, and then I believe we're almost done. Okay, yes. So community development, ecological succession. Now that we talked about resilience and resistance, community development is part of this because ecological succession is the process of development over time, which involves species in one stage being replaced by another due to disturbance. So earlier species can alter the environment in some way to make it more habitable for other species. As more species arrive, the earlier species are outcompeted and replaced. There are two types of succession that scientists have identified. There's primary succession, that is succession that begins in a previously uninhabited environment. There's no soil present, so bare rock, cooled lava fields, sand dunes. And this is the general succession pattern these ecosystems follow. It's lichen, mosses, grass, shrubs, and forest. Lichens, moss, grasses, shrubs, and then forest. Secondary succession begins in an environment following the destruction of all or part of the earlier community, abandoned farmland or an open area after fire, and it generally occurs more rapidly than primary succession. Here we have an abandoned farm field in North Carolina. Started with weeds and then some annual and perennial grasses, then seedlings of pine trees, then young pine forests, and then finally over time, 150 years after, we have the mature hardwood forest, so oaks and hickory. A very good example of secondary succession here in South Florida is through the pine rocklands, which I'll talk a little bit more about in chapter 6. And it's an ecosystem that needs regular disturbance, fire, to survive. So it needs fire every 5 to 7 years, okay? And that's because the plants in this ecosystem are adapted to survive after a fire hits it. And the way that this happens is that they basically release the seeds, kind of like they pop out, similar to acorns, once they feel the heat and the pressure of the fire. Then the seeds remain in the soil, and after the fire goes through, that secondary succession begins to occur, and you see a rapid growth of seedlings and plants and flowering. It's really, truly incredible. If you guys are interested in learning more about the pine rocklands here in South Florida, Miami-Dade County, there is a program called Environmentally Endangered Lands Program. Just look it up, Environmentally Endangered Lands Program on Google, Miami-Dade County, and they do what is described as regularly prescribed burns. So they set up a calendar where the Forest Service and the forest and the fire land managers come out to an area and do contained fires, and you can see in the weeks following after real succession happen, secondary succession. So you'll have, clear, blackened, barren, burned land, the days following. But then right after, maybe like 5 or 6 days, you'll start seeing seedlings, and within 2 or 3 weeks, you'll see flowering plants. It's truly incredible. So all of the topics discussed in community development, as well as resilience and resistance, are important for your exam. So keep that in mind. Thanks, guys.